A note before we begin, this episode recounts vicious cruelty and heinous means of death. Please take care. Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. A small boy, first name Cash, last name lost to history, ventured out early on Sunday, March 13th, 1921, to do little country boy things down by Allen's Bridge. The Yellow River flowed slowly under the bridge before it spilled into a lake. The bridge sat on the border of Newton and Jasper counties, an area dotted with small tenant farms and sawmills. In 1921, Georgia's cotton economy was in steep decline, battered by boll weevils and falling prices. At some point, Cash thought he saw a shoe poking out of the middle of the river. Then he saw it wasn't just a shoe. There was a foot in the shoe, and presumably the leg that went with it. And that was enough for Cash. He wasn't going to brave this alone. He ran for help. He soon found Carl Wheeler, who was just 18 years old. Carl went for his father and, along the way, gathered up a neighbor man as well, and they all piled into a small boat and followed the little boy along the river. There, the men confirmed the boy's story. They decided to pull on the shoe, and the rest of an entire man came with it. But the body didn't seem to want to come out of its watery grave too easily. The men soon found out why. The dead man was brutally lashed to another man who had been even more deeply submerged. Those in the boat dragged both corpses, they looked to have once been young and robust, to the riverbank to disentangle them. By then, word had reached the sheriff. More bodies were found that day and in the days that followed. The discovery drew reporters from as far as Atlanta, their notebooks filling with details of what would become known as one of Georgia's most shocking crimes. Residents had also learned of the grisly discovery. Some had been on their way to Sunday church services when they heard the news. They made their way in wagons and on foot to see what had been found. I will quote author Earl Swift, who wrote Hell Put to Shame. Quote, "Two black men lay before them, hands tied with wire behind their backs, then each man's hands to the other's so that they lay back to back. A trace chain, usually used to harness a mule to a plow, was wrapped around their necks and knotted to a short length of rope. At the rope's end was a heavy sack of rocks." End quote. When Sheriff B.L. Johnson arrived, he had the bodies laid out on the riverbank until the coroner could view them. This was only the beginning of the horrors to follow. Within a week, state and federal agents would arrive from Atlanta to trace where the men had come from. Their search would expose a farm that was part of a much larger system, one so entrenched that many officials didn't even recognize it as criminal. In fact, what Cash found that March morning would unravel one of the most shocking cases of mass murder in American history. One that would force a reckoning with a truth the nation had long refused to see, that slavery hadn't truly been amended out of existence in 1865, not if you were black, poor, and living in the South, and you had no power to end it yourself. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Ollie. So, Scott, you know our dogs aren't just pets. They're basically small, hairy family members with very strong opinions.
Especially around food. The way they judge us if dinner is 2 minutes late.
And because they're such a big part of our lives, I really do want to make choices that mean healthier, happier days for them. that's what pushed me to look for something better at mealtime.
And that's when you found Ollie.
Yep, they offer fresh, protein-packed meals made with real, human-grade ingredients, which is a win for their health.
And I noticed the difference right away. The enthusiasm level at mealtime went way up.
Truly, and I appreciate the whole experience. I mean, perfectly portioned meals, mess-free packaging, the little scoop, even the pup container so the fridge doesn't smell like dog food.
Plus that tech element, Ollie app with on-demand health screenings. I didn't expect that from a dog food company. And the tailored meal plan made it feel like we were finally feeding them based on their specific needs, not guessing.
Your dog's well-being starts with their food, and that's why Ollie delivers fresh, human-grade food that your dog will love. Head to ollie.com/COTC, tell them about your dog, and use code COTC to get 60% off your welcome kit when you subscribe today. Plus, they offer a happiness guarantee on the first box, so if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back. That's OLLIE.com/COTC and enter code COTC to get 60% off your first box. A few weeks before the grisly find in the Yellow River, Gus Chapman had made his way to Atlanta to see if he could talk to some federal agents about what he had experienced in the deep woods in nearby Jasper County. He met federal agents Adelbert J. Wismer and George W. Brown of the Bureau of Investigation, the early FBI. Chapman told them how he had been picked up in that city in January and had been charged with loitering. The fine that he'd been given for doing so was $5, an amount he could not pay. But as things would have it, a young farmer named Hewlin Williams had been on site at the courthouse and offered to pay Gus's fine if he would agree to work the debt off at Hewlin's daddy's farm, which he was told was just 40 miles south of the big city. Chapman agreed to go with him. When he got to the Williams farm, Chapman was quickly disabused of any thought that this was a good and fair deal. Locked up at night and told he'd be shot if he tried to leave, Chapman worked impossible hours with several other men in similar straits. They were frequently whipped for anything from not moving fast enough to not showing enough deference to those who held them captive. He told the agents that he had escaped once, only to be hunted down, forced at gunpoint to return to the farm to be beaten ferociously by, quote-unquote, Mr. Johnny, Hewlin's father, who made him repeatedly beg for his life. Chapman had watched as John Williams ordered his sons to, per Earl Swift again, drape the man they all knew as Blackstrap, quote, over a gasoline barrel, his hands and feet held by other field hands, and be whipped with such fury that he begged for the torture to stop, end quote. The torture did stop when Hewlin handed the pistol to another farmhand and demanded he shoot the man. That man had no choice. If he had not shot Blackstrap, he too would die that day. Chapman had, by some miracle, been allowed a second chance, but he suffered for the infringement of the farm's rules. He was given the worst possible chores and made to work through the night, through driving rain, to make up for the time he was gone. His second escape, the one the Williams family had told him would end with his certain death, was made in early December 1920. Chapman had been in hiding in Atlanta for a month. Telling the federal agents was the only way he thought he might live long enough to get out of Georgia. The agents knew this kind of thing went on. They had heard other stories, one even about the same Williams farm. That, too, had involved someone who described the equally unsavory death of a man known only as Iron Jaw. He had also pleaded to die. This time, Williams' other son, Leroy, obliged. The agents didn't get around to looking into Gus Chapman's claim straight away. Finally, on February 18, 1921, they did. They had other business out that way and figured they'd just drop in unannounced to the John Williams farm and see what was going on for themselves. For the record, they knew that, while slavery had been outlawed by the 13th Amendment, the South had figured out ways around it. This kind of so-called contract labor was a well-established practice, especially for the non-privileged Southern farmer who struggled with chaotic cotton prices and saw the freed black farmers as competition. They also knew people could be cruel. And while peonage, which is the technical word for the crime alleged here, was bad, murder was something else altogether. When Wismer and Brown went there, they looked around, asked questions, even took several of the hands off alone so that their overseers couldn't hear what they told the investigators. They gave special attention to Clyde Manning, a 26-year-old black field boss who carried out the day's work agenda while carrying a gun and keeping the others in line. They'd been told by Chapman that Manning had been the enforcer who had hunted him down for the Williamses. Manning denied it all. He was no boss, he said. He knew nothing about a guy named Blackstrap. He had not been sent to retrieve Gus Chapman. He was just a guy who earned an honest wage. Just then, the farm owner, John Williams, returned from his Friday afternoon outing into town to find the investigation underway. He appeared unbothered by the intrusion. They were welcome to look around. Asked if he knew anything about Gus Chapman, of his escape and the threats that were made against him, Williams said he knew and had employed Chapman, that Chapman had assaulted Clyde Manning's wife, and they brought him back to the farm because the Williamses were considering pressing charges against him or having the state do so. The agents looked at Manning and said, quite directly, "You lied to us about that." Asked if they could speak to others as well as his sons, Williams said he'd drive them anywhere on the farm they wanted to go. A small point here, the farm was either 325 acres or 2,000. That's a big difference, but different sources cite those two figures. Suffice it to say, it was a big spread. But back to the farm and John Williams' tour of it for the benefit of the federal government's agents. Here's Douglas Blackman, author of Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II, speaking on the PBS documentary of the same name.
There's a group of black men out in the field. The men are obviously terrified, unwilling to say almost anything. They're emaciated. They've clearly been terribly abused.
The two lawmen were even allowed to visit the house where Chapman had said the farm hands were kept locked up at night. There was just a small family living in it, as far as they could tell. They did see the open barracks where the house had been partitioned in two. It was unlocked at the time, though they could see that it could be easily barricaded shut. They also saw a machine for resoling shoes from tire treads. Nifty tool if you had hard-working farm hands of all shapes and sizes. They asked if Williams understood why they were concerned. Peonage, they explained, was illegal. Williams said he didn't know a thing about this peonage business. They explained it to him. He said, well, if that was so, every farmer who bailed out a common thief or malingerer and had him pay off his debt with a few days' work was equally guilty, and that was pretty much true of every farmer he knew. But say they were locked up and not allowed to leave, the agents continued. That was where hiring laborers crossed into wrongdoing. Pete Daniel, a curator at the National Museum of American History, picks up the narrative of that day, speaking now about John Williams' response.
He pleads that he didn't know this was against the law, that he'll do better. His intentions were good, very apologetic to these federal officials.
The agents were pretty sure that the Williamses were working a peonage operation, but didn't feel they had much to work with. Instead, they settled on extracting a promise from Williams to stop getting field hands from the local jails. He asked them if he was likely to be prosecuted. They were non-committal. Then they went on their way. And this was the South. The two agents surely knew they were swimming against the tide. As Risa Goluboff, historian and former dean of the Virginia School of Law, explained,
from almost the first moment, white Southerners were responding to try to put African Americans back into a position as close to slavery as they possibly could.
The agents probably also knew that any efforts in the last half-century to right this wrong had been, at best, uneven, at worst, non-existent. But peonage had indeed been outlawed by Congress in 1867. Violators were subject to up to $10,000 in fines and 10 years in prison. It hardly mattered. The practice had continued unabated. That was true despite the U.S. Justice Department's diligent attempts at the very start of the 20th century to end it. Their efforts had been stymied by tradition and willful disregard of the law. By then, the whole thing had been fine-tuned by local farmers and friendly justices of the peace and sheriffs that had no difficulty in rounding up black men on some charge or another when the crop was coming in or when asked. Khalil Muhammad is a professor of American Studies at Princeton and was previously at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He explains that the system
gave tremendous discretionary power for the private owner, either a landowner or a corporation or a coal mine, could be any business concern, to do what they wanted with that African American.
And by an interconnected mesh of state and local laws that bore most heavily on those without means. And peonage was a consequence of all of that. The playing field was never even in the South, before or after the Civil War, but the practice of peonage was at its greatest prevalence during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. By then, it was firmly entrenched. In 1888, just a few decades earlier, Booker T. Washington had tried to explain to the powers that be that black sharecroppers, quote, are held in a kind of slavery that is, in one sense, as bad as the slavery of antebellum days, end quote. Now, to be clear, sharecropping is different than peonage. Sharecropping was an exploitative but legal arrangement where tenant farmers would work land owned by someone else, paying rent with a share of the crop. Peonage was when people were forced to work to pay off a debt, and, like I said, it's been illegal since soon after the Civil War. Sharecroppers and the contract laborers of the day were locked in an endless cycle of debt, having to pay for seed and housing and groceries borrowed from the landowner, only to find that, at the end of the day, those costs were not covered by the labor they had put in. They were as bound as if they were in chains. Historian Daniel wrote in American Heritage magazine in 1972 that, quote, an experienced investigator estimated in 1907 that 1/3 of the large planters are holding their Negro employees to a condition of peonage, end quote. What percentage of small farmers were doing the same wasn't disclosed. It is assumed to be, in states like Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, considerably higher. That's because, by then, Reconstruction was far behind them, but something called the Black Codes had been written and upheld in the South, even as industrial competition for more laborers at the cheapest prices had begun to press harder and harder on the economy. Black Codes, by the way, weren't things like a poll tax or a requirement that you had to be literate to vote. They were more insidious laws that made, essentially, life while black illegal. Here's Blackman again.
It was a crime in the South for a farm worker to walk beside a railroad. It was a crime in the South to speak loudly in the company of white women. It was a crime to sell the products of your farm after dark.
The crime of walking alongside a railroad track? That was trespassing now. This in an era where many poor Americans hopped freight trains and slept in boxcars to get from place to place. In talking to Bill Moyers about current stop-and-frisk laws in this country, Professor Muhammad harkened back to these Black Codes.
And those codes were intended to use the criminal justice system to restrict the freedom and mobility of black people. And if you crossed any line that they prescribed, you could be sold back to your former slave owner, not as a slave, but as a prisoner to work off your fine after an auction where you were resold to the highest bidder. It tells you something about the invention of the criminal justice system as a repressive tool to keep black people in their place from the very moment when 95% of the black population became free.
The laws gave an excuse for cops to confront anyone without cause. They were enforced by local justices of the peace and small-town judges who required little by way of proof of unlawful behavior. From the YouTube documentary channel Knowing Better.
The most important and egregious one was vagrancy, which is the act of being unemployed, usually defined as when a laborer or servant loiters away his time. Do you see why so many of the recently freed slaves signed labor contracts with their former owners? Many states imposed fines on or made it illegal for black people to work in any industry other than agriculture or domestic service. So congratulations, you're free to do whatever you want. as long as it's the thing you were already doing as a slave. It was also against the law to quit your job or break a labor contract, which was prosecuted as fraud or false pretenses, as they called it in many states. As a white person, you couldn't hire a freedman without proper discharge paperwork from their previous employer. This meant that as a black person in the South, you had to have a white person who could speak for you as your employer, or at the very least, former employer. If you didn't have that protection, you ran the risk of being arrested for vagrancy.
If you were a vagrant, you were put in jail, where a friendly justice of the peace would make it all right by finding you a white benefactor who asked only that you work a few days to pay him back. Just sign this contract here. According to the National Center of Education Statistics, non-white illiteracy in this country in 1921 stood around 25%. Most people didn't even know what they were agreeing to. And if they did, who were they going to complain to? In this case, it would have always been an indigent black man against a man known in the community as successful. A man who had pulled himself up by his own bootstraps, whose wife's family had been in the region for a long time, and who had never been arrested. Williams was a God-fearing Christian, a Baptist, who went to church regularly and raised his large family, sent his sons to fight in the First World War, and voted the party line. Really, the topic wasn't even worth discussing. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Galatea. So Scott, you know how my day is basically one long sprint, work, errands, answering 30 texts that could have been one?
Amber, did you see this? Amber, can you weigh in? Amber, I have a thought. Yes, I know.
Right. So at some point, I just decided my brain deserved a tiny break that wasn't doom scrolling. And that's how I fell into Galatea, this reading app with quick hit romance stories. A couple chapters and suddenly my shoulders dropped from around my ears.
Yeah, I've walked into the room and you're clearly somewhere else entirely.
And that's the point. They've got over 1,000 stories, everything from slow burns to shifter romance to teen drama. And they're bite-sized, so you can read a little or get sucked into a full-blown binge without meaning to. It makes sense. The app just pulls you in.
Do you need an intervention?
For reading? Never. Listen, they design these things to be addictive in the fun way. New chapters and new stories drop every week, so there's always something waiting for you.
All right, give the people the deal.
Right now, Galatea is offering our listeners an extra 25% off on top of an already irresistibly affordable subscription when you go to galatea.com/COTC. That's GALATEA.com/COTC to indulge in unlimited stories for even less. Galatea.com/COTC. The thing about peonage is that it was, in 1,000 ways, worse than slavery as it was most commonly practiced in the American South. I mean, that sounds impossible. How could anything be worse than slavery? But historians, both black and white, have documented that it was. Here's YouTuber Knowing Better, again, explaining findings by investigator Stanley Finch of the U.S. Department of Justice in a 1903 report.
This system is more cruel and inhuman than the slavery of antebellum days. Since then, the master conserved the life and health of the slave for business reasons, just as he did that of his horse or mule. But now the master treated the slave unmercifully, and with the sole object of getting the greatest possible amount of labor out of him. Moreover, a convict costs but a few dollars, while a slave used to cost several hundred.
Antoinette Harrell, historian and genealogist, known for her work on post-slavery peonage in the South, spoke to a crowd at the University of New England in 2023. She called peonage the best-kept secret of American history and explained that peons were treated even worse than slaves because...
Well, in slavery as chattel property, they had a reason to protect their property, feed their property, clothe their property. But when slavery was abolished, it had a different look.
Now, the 13th Amendment's text included a carefully worded exception. Quote, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, end quote. It didn't take long for former Confederate states to realize what this meant. They could recreate slavery if they could just convict enough people of crimes. That made for the implicit legality of something called convict leasing. When states could lease out their convicts for as little as $9 a month to do industrial work like mining coal. Great, cheap labor for America's robber barons with the added plus of no union interference. By 1890, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, North and South Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia were cashing in. But that ended in most states in the early 20th century. I said most. Alabama didn't outlaw it until 1928, and it wasn't nationally outlawed until 1941. As that was waning, other exploitative systems, contract labor and sharecropping, took its place. And no one was on hand to watch the toll of abuse on rights, privileges, and human flesh. So let's go back to the Yellow River on March 13th, 1921, where a crowd had gathered on the bridge. It was Sunday, after all. People had enjoyed church and a nice lunch, and the news was spreading that bodies had been pulled from the river. The word among the spectators and the media there was that, since no one recognized the two men, somebody ought to talk to the sheriff in Jasper, because racial tensions had been high there of late and it wasn't far. It seemed as good a place to start as any. Atlanta's federal agents got to the scene as well, and soon the sheriff announced a reward for information about who might have done this thing. Wismer and Brown silently worried that the dead men were from the Williams farm. Then Wednesday came, and a mile away from the Yellow River crime scene, two more feet had edged themselves out of the water. This time, it was the South River that held the horrors. A man, similarly shackled, chained, and weighted down, came out of the water to be lain by the riverbank. No one recognized him either. Though some sharp-eyed reporter from the Atlanta Constitution noted that the dead man had on shoes that had been recently resoled with tire treads. Then a white man named Eberhard Crawford, age 63, told police that he'd been one of the spectators on the bridge that first night and that he had made the offhanded comment that maybe the hands on Williams' farm might know these dead fellas. That same night, he told the feds, John Williams showed up at his door, angry and demanding to know why he had mentioned Williams' name. Crawford took it as a threat and wanted no part of that. He knew that Williams could be vindictive and cruel. Attention now turned more seriously to the Williams farm. Hugh Dorsey, the governor of Georgia, had his own reasons for paying attention to the case. 8 years earlier, he'd wrongly prosecuted a Jewish man for a crime. The man was later lynched by a mob for it. And though Dorsey didn't say so at the time, maybe he knew the man was innocent, because now he seemed to go out of his way to perhaps atone for that. Or maybe he just learned something. Or maybe this was just too big of a case, now that national newspapers were reporting on it, for him to ignore. It was time to redeem Georgia in the eyes of the nation. So Dorsey put his full power behind the investigation, pledging that the state would get to the bottom of this. Early in the investigation, when Clyde Manning was pressed, when he was shown the faces of the men, he feigned ignorance. He didn't know them. He didn't know what had happened to them. Within days, aiming to force the large and imposing man to tell all, authorities arrested Manning, who again confessed to nothing. By then, John Williams and his sons had also sat down for an interview, as had Frank Dozier, another local man who had labored on the farm. Dozier veered from the script. He told a story of constant hunger, frequent torture, and nightly captivity. Now, they were getting somewhere. Promised that he would not have to return to the farm and that he would be given protection from the Williamses, Clyde Manning started to talk. According to Earl Swift, Manning began telling them how he killed his first man for the Williams, a guy named Bill Napier. That was a while back. Then he killed Blackstrap, as Chapman had witnessed and recounted to the agents. He had done what he was told to do. And he had more. He said that a few days after the federal agents had visited the farm, Mr. Johnny had told him, quote, "We're going to have to get rid of these boys," end quote. He told them how Williams asked a few of the farmhands if they wanted to go home, and they said they did. and he put them in his big car and drove them somewhere. Manning didn't know where. He never saw them again. Then Williams directed Manning to kill a few of the remaining men. He told Manning, per the Fed's notes on the interview, quote, "If you don't want to do it, it's all right, but it's your neck or theirs," end quote. Some Manning axed to death while they worked. Some he and others bound with wire and put into the river alive. One man, similarly bound, asked to be allowed to put himself into the river. He was allowed to sit on the edge of the bridge for a minute or so before he threw himself off to his death. Others were told they were going to dig a well. Those holes turned into their own graves. Manning spared no detail. In each case, he told the agents that he had protested that he didn't want to do any of this, but that Williams gave him no choice. Manning then led a small entourage of men in boats equipped with tools on a tour of the local rivers and county land where he knew 9 other bodies could be found. He put a name to every one. Johnny Williams, no relation to Mr. Johnny, John Will Gaither, nicknamed Big John, John Brown, nicknamed Red, John Little Bit Benson, Lindsey Peterson, Willie Preston, Harry Price, known as Foots. Foots was the man who jumped to his death, Johnny Green, Willie Gibbons, Charlie Chisholm, Fletcher Smith. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Storyworth. So every year I run into the same problem. What do you buy for the family members who claim they don't want anything? My dad is the king of that group.
Oh yeah, he never needs anything except another guitar to add to his collection.
He has so many guitars. Well, one year I got him Storyworth, and it's wild. I mean, I've known the man my whole life, and then suddenly he drops some detail that makes me go, wait, what? How did I not know this? I'm telling you, I legit love the book. Having his stories in writing, plus the photos, it feels like something our family's gonna keep around forever.
It really turned out cool.
Right? And that's why I recommend Storyworth memoirs for your loved ones this holiday season.
The weekly questions make it simple. You pick the prompts, they answer, either by email or just recording a story over the phone.
Storyworth keeps it so simple, and at the end of the year, they compile everything, stories and photos, into a gorgeous hardcover book.
And they've added new tools this year. Personalized questions, a magic editor, new book designs, even Spanish language support.
And it's clearly beloved. Over 1 million books printed, 35 million stories preserved, 48,000 5-star reviews. It's one of the rare gifts people actually use and treasure.
Give your loved ones a unique keepsake you'll all cherish for years. Storyworth Memoirs.
Right now, save $10 or more during their holiday sale when you go to storyworth.com/COTC. That's storyworth.com/COTC to save $10 or more on your order. On March 24th, John Williams was busy feigning innocence to anyone who wanted to ask him about the bodies in the river. He had not seen the bodies, he said, and hadn't been around to identify them one way or another. He offered to help find the perpetrators of these horrible crimes. He would pay for those evildoers to be found. He talked to law enforcement, grand juries, whoever. Meanwhile, on that same day, Clyde Manning told a grand jury the exact same story he told the federal agents, in all of its horrifying detail. In exchange, he and a fellow witness were, quote, rushed to Atlanta for safekeeping, end quote, according to a Wire report published that day. That meant the feds were working hard to ensure the men weren't lynched. By day's end, Manning and his boss were both indicted for a single murder, but prosecutors were clearly not finished doing the indicting. The feds were just getting started. The New York Times outlined the bare facts that Friday, but was able, by its Sunday publication date, to talk to Clyde Manning, who, once the floodgates opened, didn't shy from relaying the horrifying details. Some news outlets wrote that Manning was unemotional while he told of the murders, even impersonal. Later experts would recognize that Manning, a victim of systemic, long-term torture, would be not only depressed, but dehumanized by his shame. Years of brutalization may have fundamentally broken something in him, his ability to think clearly, to protect himself, to know right from wrong. But in 1921, he was simply deemed unemotional, a term that clearly meant to show that he was unfeeling and unconcerned. The Atlanta Georgian also uncovered the awful fact that Manning's own father had been murdered on the farm when the young man was a teenager, which would explain a lot. It was not long after that the state and national media began to dub the Williams place the murder farm. Learning of the case, the nascent NAACP, founded a little more than a decade before, called upon its members to deluge President Warren G. Harding, labor unions, and northern litigators with letters encouraging an open war on the peonage system, actions that, quote, colored voters and fair-minded white voters, end quote, would, they said, remember come Election Day. A brief aside here. Historian Antoinette Harrell has chased down every one of the 30,000 documents in the National Archives relating to the peonage issues, including letters sent to Presidents Calvin Coolidge, Harding, and Franklin Roosevelt. That FDR was still receiving them in 1944 shows how ineffective the protest was. Back in Georgia, it's still 1921, and Governor Dorsey's zeal for justice, however he might have come to it, was obvious when, only a few days into the investigation, he convened an all-star band of legal eagles to conduct the prosecution's case. He must have thought it was beyond the capabilities of the small county, rural, backcountry legal guardians. His dream team included the state's attorney general, its solicitor general, an assistant attorney general, and the head guy at the Bureau of Investigation in Atlanta. They had arrested and locked up John Williams at first in Newton County, then moved him to an Atlanta jail. He had, quite adeptly, sent his 3 sons away on a buying trip to Texas, he said, temporarily putting them out of reach of law enforcement. Later, when they failed to show in court, he said that he had no idea why they missed it. So it's safe to assume he had decided he was going to take one for the team, though he may have realistically believed that this was all a minor inconvenience. Or maybe he didn't. Days before the bodies were discovered, Williams had transferred all his property to 2 defense attorneys, Green Johnson and Charles Chester King, quote, for the legal services to be rendered by said party of the first by parties of the second part, end quote. Curious. Maybe he knew, if matters became public, that he would need quality help. The NAACP quickly realized that quality help was also something that Clyde Manning would need, as no one was rushing to his defense after prosecutors made it clear they would also be trying him for the murders. The civil rights organization hired native Georgian Marvin Underwood, a white man who had been the Assistant Attorney General of the United States from 1914 to 1917, a past general counsel for the U.S. Railroad Administration, and a man who would later serve as a federal judge beginning in 1931 until his death in 1960. Manning would have what could be considered one of the finest lawyers in the land on his side. Fair was fair. Both men would be tried, but separately, at the Newton County Courthouse in Covington, Georgia. First up was John Williams, the Honorable Judge John B. Hutchison presiding. The trial began April 5, 1921, just over 3 weeks since young country boy Cash had spotted a foot sticking out of the river. The jury consisted of 12 white men. The second-floor courtroom was packed to overflowing every day. Agents Wismer and Brown were the first to testify, then the state asked Clyde Manning to take the stand. The litany of woe that Manning described to the jury was rote by now. He never wavered in the details, but this time was prompted by prosecutors to explain each and every move John Williams made during the murders, how he was the one who drove the farmhands to the locations of their death, how he lugged the 100-pound sacks of rocks that were tied to their bodies before they were thrown into the river, or, in the case of Harry Price, before he threw himself in. Then the prosecution had Manning describe the deaths of other hands who had died before the feds had shown up. Thus, the jury heard about how Blackstrap, Red, Longjaw, Little Bit, and Big John had all been killed, how Mr. Johnny's sons Marvin, Hulan, and Leroy had been present or had participated in some way in the various men's demises, how a man named Fletcher Smith had been killed by a shotgun blast courtesy of Mr. Johnny, how they buried him where he fell. In several instances of the deaths that occurred after the Fed's visit, the men had been told by Williams they were going to be freed. Mr. Johnny promised he would make sure they reached the train station safely. Instead, they all willingly climbed into his big car to be driven to their deaths. Manning also told the jury he had wanted no one to die. He was just trapped. He was 26 years old. He had a wife and children. Early on, he had sharecropped with John Williams. After that, he was paid $20 a month for his labor. He knew no other life than this. He knew it was wrong. He hadn't wanted to do any of it, but he said he had no choice. He stepped down, and others who knew of the killings, though not in the proximity or detail that Manning had testified to, were brought in to bolster his story. This was necessary because in Georgia, as a confessed accomplice, he could not be the only one who testified against Williams. When the state rested, the defense called John Williams to the stand. Under Georgia law at the time, the defendant was allowed to make a statement without swearing to tell the truth. It was not a statement that was allowed to be questioned or cross-examined in any way. It was just a guy making his own case, as if he were at the dinner table. Williams was a pretty convincing good old boy up there. He was simply a 54-year-old father of 12. He had a stellar record of community and church life. He said he figured that when he bailed those young men out of their indebtedness to the state, that he was doing what every other farmer in these parts did. He meant no harm. He said the day after the feds came around, he told all his hands that they were free to go. When some said they wanted to leave, he said he gave them each $5 and they went off and he had no idea where. The last man he saw them with was Clyde Manning. The way he told it, every one of his farmhands' departures ended the same way. They were last in the company of Clyde Manning, whom he portrayed as mean, cruel, violent, abusive of his wife to the point that Williams once had to save her from sure death. He said he was as innocent as a newborn lamb. Really, he said that. And that was the beginning, middle, and end of the defense's case on behalf of John Williams. The trial lasted all of 4 days. Judge Hutchison's jury instructions were straightforward, especially in relation to Clyde Manning's testimony against Williams. Here's part of the charge. Quote, "If it appears to you that such witness was forced by coercion to take the part that he did, provided you believe that he did in fact take a part, and that such coercion was of such a nature as to excite in the mind of such witness a reasonable fear that his life was in danger," end quote, then he was not an accomplice, but a victim. The judge added that if Manning was found to not be an accomplice, then that rule about needing corroboration for his story didn't apply. If the verdict was guilty, the jury was told, Williams could be sentenced to life in prison or death by hanging. There was no other option. The press reported that Williams smiled throughout. He seemed to know this would all be over soon. The Southern press figured on an early verdict. The New York papers figured that the best outcome would be a mistrial. Nobody traveled too far from the courthouse while the verdict was still out. The jury came back to the judge late that first night and asked him to reread his instructions. He did so. In the morning, they had a verdict. Quote, "We, the jury, find the defendant, John S. Williams, guilty and recommend mercy," end quote. Thus, John Williams became the first white man in the South convicted of the first-degree murder of a black man since 1877, when Reconstruction was still in effect. The judge agreed with the jury and ruled that Williams wouldn't hang. Clyde Manning's murder trial took place May 30th, wrapping up June 1st. He was found guilty, but the verdict was vacated by a technicality. A second trial followed on July 26 and July 27, 1922. His statement, like the one that Williams gave to his jury, was a plaintive plea for some kind of understanding of his predicament. The transcript reads, quote, "The crime which I done to save my own life. After these killings started, he would call me all through the night. He would call me during the night to see if the cows were in the wheat or in the oats, and he would say he heard a noise with the mules, and I figured he was calling me to see if I was off the place," end quote. If he had been, he said, Williams would have found him, brought him back to the farm, and killed him on the spot. In the 1972 American Heritage piece written by historian Pete Daniel, the author explained that Manning told the jury that he thought of leaving the farm many times, but having never been much away from it, he was too unfamiliar with anywhere else to think he could succeed. He also said he had his mother, his sister, and his wife to think about. They were still on the farm. He said, quote, "I am not crying for mercy, just give me justice," end quote. He too was found guilty of first-degree murder. He too got life in prison. Williams' lawyers didn't quit on his behalf. They moved for a new trial immediately, an effort that continued over the next few years. In one instance, Williams even argued that he was not guilty of peonage, but of slavery, and that, surprise, surprise, while outlawed in this country, did not carry a legal penalty. Some loophole, that. The point was moot. He was still guilty of murder. Hulan, Leroy, and Marvin Williams were never charged. And peonage, while it had been dealt a very public blow, did not die with those 11 men. According to historian Daniel, quote, "The United States Commission on Civil Rights complained in 1961 that between January 1st, 1958 and June 30th, 1960, 67 accusations were brought to the Justice Department, but no prosecutions followed because none of the charges was deemed valid. Another analysis showed that between 1961 and 1963, the department dropped 92 out of 104 complaints without even an investigation, and followed up only 2 with prosecution. And in July of 1969, the New Republic revealed peonage-like conditions among migratory workers in Florida, but Justice Department lawyers denied the institution still existed," end quote. Clyde Manning died in prison in 1927. Differing accounts exist of his death. One has it that he succumbed to tuberculosis, the other that he died on the chain gang. Both could be true. Williams died in prison in 1931. He either died in an accident or while acting as a trustee on a prison farm, killed trying to prevent a jailbreak. Earl Swift went looking for the graves of the men murdered in Jasper County during those awful days in February 1921. The men had been removed from the rivers, the riverbanks, the meadows, and other locales on the murder farm. They took up temporary residence at the coroner's office, then were taken by mule-drawn wagon to the Jasper County burial ground for paupers, which, despite the name, was considered a proper cemetery. They were placed in pine coffins and returned to the earth. But somewhere in the last 100 years, Swift reports that the county lost track of where exactly that cemetery was. Swift could find no maps, and no survivors could pinpoint its precise location. More figurative digging showed that the cemetery might be behind the present-day sheriff's office, where there's a senior center, the dog pound, public works detritus, baseball fields, and a landfill. Still, more investigation came up empty. Throughout the years, when skeletal remains are found in the shallows of the lake, people wonder if they belong to some of the men who were killed in Newton County and dumped into the water. Officials have been unwilling to dredge the river or lake to search for them. On a side note, there is no record of any farmhand ever paying off his debt to Williams. One reported having made 35 cents one year, not enough to make a dent in the debt he owed. On a final note, Charles W. Chestnut wrote a piece in September 1904, about 17 years before the murder farm was uncovered, that was published in an issue of Voice of the Negro entitled Peonage, or The New Slavery. In it, he made a profound statement about the practice and of the South in general. He wrote, quote, "Nothing is slower than social movements. A form of government may be radically changed and laws easily enacted without modifying for a long period thereafter the social customs, the habits of thought, the feelings of a people," end quote. The murder farm case saw a white man held responsible for the death of a black one. The next time a white Southerner was convicted of the first-degree murder of a black man in Georgia was 45 years later in 1966. To research this case, journalist Amy Wilson leaned heavily on the terrific work done by Earl Swift in his Hell Put to Shame, the 1921 Murder Farm Massacre, and the Horror of America's Second Slavery. It was written just last year. She also watched the PBS documentary Slavery by Another Name, some audio excerpts from which are included here. She read Pete Daniels' American Heritage piece that was based on his book, The Shadow of Slavery, Peonage in the South, 1901 to 1969, and she read excerpts from Gregory Freeman's Lay This Body Down, the 1921 Murder of 11 Plantation Slaves. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Head to www.grabbagcollab.com for exclusive content related to this show and access to other series on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and sometimes my child, Hunt Van Benscoten. Other music comes from Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, please help us out by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts. Also tell your friends. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're @centuriespod, and you can find us on the Crimes of the Centuries Facebook page.